It's May 4th, 2021, and this is our bi-weekly Zoom call on the topic of the role of spirituality. The Special Fathers Network is a dad-to-dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. And we arrange these bi-weekly calls on topics the dads have selected. And we have a couple of guests tonight who are eminently qualified to speak on the topic of the role of spirituality. And I'll just say before we get started that one of the most difficult things for a family raising a child, or in some cases children with special needs, is participating in their church or their synagogue. Oftentimes these religious organizations are not very welcoming or set up to accommodate people who have differences. And my experience or witness is that it's the largest organizations, the mega churches and big organizations that have budgets and have the resources to make it a little bit easier for families with special needs, but that's not always the case. So what I'd like to do is ask each of our Special Fathers Network mentor fathers to make a brief self-introduction, which would include who they are, where they're from, what type of work they do or did, for the case that we have a retired mentor father with us tonight as well, and a little bit about themselves. So Cory, Estby, I'd like you to go first. And Cory was podcast dad number 74. So literally 70 something episodes ago. Cory, the Zoom stage is yours.
Wow, 70 episodes ago. That's amazing. It doesn't seem that long ago that we were visiting, and so that I commend you for the work of preparation and getting those episodes out. Yes, thank you for the invitation to be here tonight to talk about the role of spirituality. I am Cory Estby. I am a Lutheran pastor serving a congregation in Grant Park, Illinois, about an hour south of Chicago, and have been serving here for almost 16 years in this congregation. Wife of almost 22 years this summer. Do have 4 children, 2 of them biological, 18 and 16-year-old Gabriel and Kaylee, and then also 2 younger children who are age 7 and 5 with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And so we have been faced with physical progressiveness in regards to the challenges that come. And as a congregation that I serve, a Lutheran congregation, they've actually been very receptive over the last 3 years in regards to that need, especially related to living accommodations. As I live in the parsonage next door, it just was not accessible. And so they made a congregation financial decision to go ahead and demolish the old house, build new on site that'll be fully accessible for our children, that within the next 2 weeks, we'll actually be moving back into that house and getting established for the future care of them.
Cory, thank you for that brief self-introduction. Dr. William Danko, if I can call you Bill, is podcast dad number 125. And I'd like you to make a brief self-introduction as well.
David, thank you. We've met on a professional basis to talk about money, of all things. And my background is I grew up in a household where my dad died when I was 5 years old, and my widowed mother, took care of us, and including eventually my quadriplegic brother. And when she had a major stroke in 1996, I became my brother's keeper, and I vowed to keep him out of a nursing home. And I was fortunate in my professional career to be able to afford to buy him a house that was all wheelchair accessible. And so for the next 20 years, as my brother's keeper, and I was with him most days and certainly most weekends, because it was so difficult to get a weekend aide to take care of a guy who couldn't even scratch his nose. And so I would, feed him, bathe him, dress him. And he was 5 years my senior, and he died in 2015. But so we're going on 6 years now since his passing. But it was quite an experience dealing with somebody when, here I am, you called me doctor. Yes, I'm a PhD, university professor, accomplished author, consultant on the speaking tour. But here I am dealing with a guy who really had very limited abilities to do anything. And quite frankly, I was fortunate to be able to care for him. It really gave me a real perspective about life, not only from my father, knowing that life is short, but certainly seeing the steady progression of my brother's disability, saying, look, money is good, but money and happiness and purpose are far more important than just emphasizing, the worldly need to have a career. So, that's briefly my story. I enjoy life. I'm fortunate. I'm married once, still have my wife, and have 3 kids and 5 grandkids, and it's wonderful.
Well, Bill, thank you for being with us, and thank you for that brief self-introduction. And Bill's a rather modest guy, so I will put a little plug in for what he was referring to as an accomplished author. So it was with a former colleague of his, Dr. Thomas Stanley, that they wrote this groundbreaking book back in the mid-1990s called The Millionaire Next Door, after doing 20 years worth of research about wealth accumulation. And then more recently, with a different author, he wrote the book Richer Than a Millionaire. Oh, there you go. And they're brilliant pieces. They have nothing to do specifically with special needs, but I think of them as must-reads for people that have any interest at all in wealth accumulation. It's not a complicated situation. It's like losing weight. Eat fewer calories and exercise more. It's make more money and spend less. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. But they've done some really interesting research. And I just want to say thank you to both of you for being part of the Special Fathers Network and being with us tonight. So I have a number of questions that I'd like to ask. And I think it would be helpful. I know, Cory, you already made reference a bit as part of your introduction, but I'd like to have each of you reflect on your religious background and your spiritual journey. It doesn't have to go into a lot of detail, but just so that the listening audience, viewers, will have a better appreciation for where you're coming from. So we'll just go in the same order. Cory, back to you.
Thank you. Yeah, you say spiritual journey, and it truly is a good description of life as a journey. From early beginnings in which we have no control over that beginning. I didn't choose to be born. Certainly was, a gift from what I say, a gift from God for my parents to have me and raise me up. What was their role? Physical needs, of course, to take care of me as a child. Emotional needs, to show love and care and support and build friendship and family interactions, certainly. But they also felt a need for the spiritual care of me as a child. And so within the Lutheran faith that I was raised in, began very early, within 3 weeks, being baptized in the Christian faith with water and God's word in the triune name of God. That faith then was fed through the years through biblical instruction, regular attendance at church and hearing God's word, and a fellowship of the body gathered together to hear that word. And for the Lutheran faith, a time of instruction, usually around young teenager, 12, 13, 14 years old, of biblical instruction and confirming that baptismal faith then in order to further receive the gifts of God and receiving the sacrament of the altar, the Lord's Supper. For me, boy, it was just an unquestioned thing. My parents led that, guided me through. We had family devotions and prayers. We read scriptures together. I learned, memorized things. And then it just continued on. Teenage years into college, continuing that journey. And I was thankful that God provided a wife that also was in the same line of spirituality of the Lutheran faith. We attended service together. We were married in the church, and yet vocationally, this collar and such wasn't my initial vocation. I actually was a music educator for a couple of years in the public school systems. Church was one component of my life in the midst of teaching, in the midst of singing, in the midst of that background, as an important subset to it. It was later on then, as a second career, that I then went to seminary and I guess you could say got grabbed by the neck and pulled into the ministry. Because I always hesitate if someone says I want to be a pastor from early childhood, because I kind of just wonder what that all entails and why. This certainly is a vocation that, it is a godly vocation. You are called into the office, and yet what it all entails is a recognition that I'm not worthy to do what I do, right? I don't have all the answers. And yet, as a shepherd, a spiritual guide, to allow those who are lost to ask questions, to regain that track that maybe they've gone off on, and address it. I guess the great joy is we're free to admit wrongdoing. We're free to admit that we don't know everything, and can really surround ourselves with others who can shepherd us and care for us in that regard. So, yeah, I continue to work with a variety of children, young adults, married couples, transitioning in life to the middle age, elderly, the dying, at all stages of pastoral care to guide them through what we will term this valley of the shadow of death that isn't easy. Dr. Danko had a great description of it. All the expectations that we might have, we learn the value of each of them.
Cory, thanks for sharing. And if I could paraphrase, you didn't set out to be a pastor or a priest, but it's something that you felt called to do, maybe mid-career, if you will. And I just want to say thank you for what you do on behalf of the community. Bill, back to you.
I understand exactly where Cory is coming from. My wife is Lutheran, I'm Roman Catholic. And in fact, a very dear pastor, a Lutheran pastor, who's no longer with us, Charles Lindholm, he co-presided at the marriages of my first and second child. My third child was not married yet, but he was absolutely integral as a family friend and a spiritual guide. And in fact, even at my mother's funeral, he was a co-celebrant with a Roman Catholic priest, which was, I wouldn't have it any other way. We get so caught up in this material world, and there are certain folks that you can really talk to, and such as a priest or a Lutheran pastor or any kind of pastor. We all need to have some sort of sounding board. And when we look at all the relativism, the moral relativism we have in our society, and we see all the different directions folks are going in, which causes conflict. We got to get back to a stake in the ground, okay? And how about certain things such as honor thy father and mother? What about that commandment? If we just get back to some basic principles, I think we'll all be better off. And I know I have internalized those principles, or I try to anyway. And this is why I felt a need to be a caregiver to my brother and keeping him out of a nursing home, and doing the best I could do to help him age with dignity. So, yeah, again, the formal education I've had, going through the PhD program, studying statistics and operations research and all the other things, yeah, I made money. But when it comes down to, what do you really have to do? And that is care for one another. And I, even though I don't have a disabled child myself, my point is caring for my own brother. I would do it for my sister as well, for that matter. But my point is we must be more caring, and that I think it's been ingrained in me. You know what? I think I learned about this in the very first funeral that I attended, and that was when I was 5 years old, when I went to my father's funeral. I didn't really understand all the details at the time, but you realize that life is short, and boy, it's all these in fact, Pastor Cory, perhaps you can elaborate on this. Was it in the book of Sirach? If you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. Is that in Sirach? I don't know where it is, but it seems to me that's something that I heard somewhere from the pulpit. And we have all of the idea that we can control our own destiny. Yeah, you look two ways before you cross the street. I get it. But to have the bigger picture of being in control of where you think your life is going is just an illusion. So, having a greater faith, I think, is absolutely essential. And I know my brother had that. And I believe I have it too. And it's you just have to deal with the situation that you find yourself in. It's so easy to quit. It's so easy to quit, and I get it. But I think there's a greater satisfaction. In fact, look, I hate to reduce this to empirical research, but in my research in Richer Than a Millionaire, it is clear that those who are givers have a greater life satisfaction. Givers of their time, their talent, their treasure, have greater life satisfaction than those who just feel that they can never have enough and have this narcissism that they need more. That's a sad existence in my view. The givers are far better off in our society, and they make a better society for that matter.
Bill, thank you. So I just want to acknowledge that we have two Christian religions covered. We are not covering all religions. We're not talking about Hinduism or Buddhism or Muslim. We're not talking about Judaism, for that matter. We're talking about Lutheranism and Catholicism. So I just want to acknowledge that we have two perspectives. This is not meant to be a comprehensive conversation about the role of spirituality, that would encompass everyone. But I think that using these two perspectives, we'll be able to uncover some commonality that doesn't relate to one particular religion or another. And the big issue, at least the one that comes up over and over and over in the conversations that I have with families, mostly from a dad's perspective, are that going to church is very difficult. Going to synagogue is very difficult. Going to mosque is very difficult when you have a child or children with special needs. And I'd like you to reflect on this more from a personal perspective. Cory, with you and the boys who are still quite young with their special needs. And then Bill, from your perspective, with the way that Tony, your brother, was able to experience Catholicism. So Cory, back to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that opportunity to reflect on that, and kind of stemming off of what Dr. Danko had mentioned. God is in control. Whoever we want to name as God, they're an acknowledgement of a divine creator. and our purpose in life. We've been looking at a resource here. I like to talk about vocation quite a bit, and Dr. Danko kind of mentioned it as well. You know, we have all these callings in our life. It's not just one singular calling that we're aiming for as one big thing, and yet I like to talk callings in plurals, because I do have a duty as a pastor to my congregation. I certainly have a duty as a husband to my wife. I have a duty as a father to my children. I have a duty as a son to my parents who are 600 miles away. And all of those play into the role of my callings in life in a plural aspect that ultimately I do have some control over. Unfortunately, many times that control turns into negatives in regards to my choices and opportunities of either neglect of one area over another, or regret of not being able to do something that I perceived I would want to do. David, getting to your question though, in regards to kind of disability and congregation, there is a reality to almost an exclusionary component. I think 90% of disabled individuals and families are unchurched as a general number. Why? I think it is, inaccessibility, and by that I don't mean physical inaccessibility, but rather a deep concern of, will I be welcomed? Will I be looked upon as different? How will I even be, provided the resources that might be necessary when all of those special needs are different? And who best and who qualified more than the caregiver, whether it's a parent, a brother? They're the ones that ultimately need to share and say, here's the needs, here's what would be best to serve. And a lot of congregations just are not talking about that, not aware of it. Whether it's the autism spectrum, in which those special needs of autism, whether it's a sensory processing thing. Oftentimes, you come into a church and what do you hear? Loud organ music. And to come to reality of, some children, that sound just bothers their ears and agitates them. Is there a way to soften that or allow them to be in a different environment to hear that word and participate? Allowing them to be included in that fellowship without simply excluding them from everything to say, well, you're here and we're just going to place you somewhere else. No, we want to include them in the midst of it and allow them to grow in their faith and spirituality in that regard. And so it is a conversation to have from the normal aspect of things to go, how can we be more providing for that? We have an organization here in the Northern Illinois district called the Voice of Care. Voice of Care is a disability ministry that seeks to participate not only within group homes, but also provide the tools necessary for congregations to have those conversations and be aware and have an outreach to speak to those families to say, hey, we know you're not with us. How can we involve you in that conversation to know those specificities?
Cory, thanks for sharing. Bill, back to you. And again, I want to get an insight from you about how Tony was able to experience his spirituality given his significant disability, and what role perhaps that you played.
Yeah. Okay. I used to drive a Mercedes, and when I realized that I'm going to be more and more involved with my brother's caregiving, I bought a wheelchair van, and that was really quite useful, to get him to where we had to go. And we were fortunate that the Roman Catholic Church that we happened to attend was only about a half a mile from where we lived. And so on nice days, I would actually wheel him down the sidewalk, and broke a number of casters on his wheelchair doing that. But we would get to the church. But yeah, he was very welcome. And, one of the things, there's a wheelchair section within the church that the that is made specifically for those, who have this particular need. It's integrated within the church itself, but it makes it easy. There's no pew or a chair to get in the way. Yeah, my experience, at least, from the Roman Catholic perspective, and the way the disabled have been welcomed, has certainly been very positive. In fact, one of the things that I know one of my priest friends have said, we think of the church as those who are most in need. And when you look at most in need, physical needs, mental needs, the autism needs, whatever they may be, but those who need most of the healing. I find it quite welcoming. When you made that remark about, we're just talking about, okay, Lutherans, Catholics. Well, look, I think it's much more broad than that. Again, going back to, the research I've done on the rich and happy elements. When you look at Judaism, the idea of, giving your coat to the naked and feeding the poor, and the hungry, from Isaiah. That's clearly one of the mandates for a justified Jew. And one of the pillars of Islam is almsgiving, So, I think this is pretty broad in terms of what it means to be, well integrated, whether you be a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, being this idea of being a giver and helping others, I think is really good for our overall society. And it's good for your own temperament too, quite frankly. You feel good about yourself, about being able to share what you have with others. When we become so confined and so narcissistic about, it's about me, boy, that's a sad life indeed. And so, the way I met my wife was when my brother was a patient at a rehab hospital, and she was not his therapist, but that's where I met her. But all you have to do is go to a rehab hospital and say, my goodness, I have no problems. There are so many people who have just desperate issues that have to be resolved. And if you could help them with those issues, again, it's good for you, and it'll certainly be good for them. So, not everybody has that perspective. Not everybody's going to go walk into a rehab hospital on their own and say, boy, I want to see what's going on. But once you go see what's going on, and you see a concentration of people with issues, severe disabilities, it makes you so grateful that, my goodness, my problems are minuscule compared to others, and I can help them. And if you have that in your heart to help them, you're both of you will be better off, quite frankly.
Bill, thanks for sharing. There's no question that service above self is not something that everybody feels drawn toward, but I think that your message is loud and clear that when you can find something that's bigger than yourself, it usually helps you put your own situation in perspective. And I'll just reflect a little bit on working with dads raising kids with special needs, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. I'm reminded on a daily basis, what blessings that my wife and I have with 5, adult children and a grandchild now, and, mostly healthy, but not entirely. And, I've often thought that we're all a step or a heartbeat away from experiencing disability ourselves. And whenever you see something in the community, whether it's in the church or the synagogue or the mosque or beyond, it's a reminder, right, to count your blessings and be grateful for what you have. So one of the other issues that often comes up in the conversations, especially with the Dad to Dad podcast interviews that I've been doing for the last few years, is the concept of a crisis of faith. And I'm wondering if each of you can speak to an experience that you've had yourself where you might have had a large, if not a small, crisis of faith yourself, or maybe you've been witness to a crisis of faith either in your family or beyond that you can share with our listeners or our viewers. Cory, back to you.
Wow, I will certainly reflect on that, and in listening to everything, certainly the summary, is our opportunities in which God has called us to love, and that means love God and love your neighbor, and that's a great summary in regards to everything that's been talked about. It's the ability to see a need, ability to respond to a need in a very compassionate way, and live our lives, as the words have come up, in gratitude and thanksgiving for all that we have. And it's all borrowed in the first place, and we're asked to be good stewards of that. Crisis of faith is a very, I guess, keen awareness of that statement. What constitutes a crisis? I think it's very individually based. Right? What might cause a crisis for me to somebody else would be general happenstance, everyday activity. Right? So what we're able to endure in the midst of our lives is very individual. Some are faced with very difficult childhood, abusive relationships, or neglect, or surviving on very little. Others in regards to an abundance, and you take one little minor thing away from them and they just don't know how to react and respond to that, and whether it's a selfish nature or narcissistic that Dr. Danko has talked about and such. In regards to faith, it becomes very personal, because the response is, what's been taken away from me? What am I missing? Right? What has happened? And who's responsible for it? I think in the very beginning, the crisis of faith occurred with a blame game. Right? Well, not me, it's somebody else who did this to me. I'm not going to take responsibility for it. And then it proceeded from there. But God, why did this happen? Right? Early on in our marriage, we had a miscarriage within a child. I was actually in seminary at the time, my first year, and why did we not have the opportunity to hold this child in our arms, before the birth of life occurred? In regards to the adoption that we did with our two boys, outside perspectives almost saw it as a crisis of faith, saying, how can you put everything else aside to now care for the boys that need you? I guess personally, I'm not sure I've been in the midst of a crisis of faith in that regard, of a question of questioning God, questioning his abilities to do things. Certainly, we've had to endure through a lot of loss, a lot of sadness at times, but there's great joys that come in the midst of it too. As a pastor, in handling other people's crisis of faith, that becomes very difficult, to simply be present with them, to express a comfort, but it really takes a large listening ear to simply process where they are at and then respond accordingly. We're quick to jump to Mr. Fix-Its. And especially for a father's network, that's probably it. We just want to fix everything and tell me how to do it now so that's all gone. We can't do that all the time. And sometimes there isn't a fix for it. And ultimately, it's a matter of, you're not alone. I'm beside you. I'll walk with you through this trial, through this temptation, through this problem, and we'll see where we end up in days ahead. But I'm going to hold your hand. I'm going to be with you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to love you. Let's just see what God has in store for those days ahead.
Cory, thanks for sharing. Bill, back to you.
is something I have shared with 3 people previous to this question. It's about my mother. She had a major stroke in 1996 and died about a year later. But at the time, I was not only the caregiver to her and my brother, and you can imagine that, dealing with all of her, bathing needs and everything else. Mom, what dress do you want to wear today? Something as simple as that. But you know what she told me? Now, I'm the youngest of 4 children. And so my dad died in 1957. I was born in 1952. And he had a debilitating disease prior to that when she was pregnant with me. And as a Roman Catholic brought up in the, pre-Vatican II and, well, just a strict Catholic, believe it or not, she said, I was thinking of an abortion. How could I possibly raise another child with a dead husband? And, but she didn't, obviously. And she told me, I am so glad I did not do that. I am a right to life advocate. There is no such thing as a bad birth. I mean, you just deal with it, And again, David and Cory, I've never shared this, certainly not in public like this. So when you talk about a test of faith and what has to be done, I really look up to my mother as a model, saying, doing the right thing, giving birth. And as it turns out, I would not have the success I had if I was not born. I would not be able to be the caregiver to my brother if I was not born. And so, there are other tests of faith. I mean, I've had friends who've been murdered. I mean, God, you say, how wrong is that? It's wrong. It's just wrong. But to say that, I'm only here because my mother decided that the right thing to do was to bring me into this world. And that's something that I've shared, not in those words with my children and grandchildren, but now that it's public, it's fair game now. They'll be hearing about it. And I think they should.
Well, Bill, thank you for sharing that very personal story.
Yeah.
And it's palpable. And what a great testimony to your mom, knowing that her husband, your dad, would probably not be around for a long period of time, and that she would be a widow raising 3 boys or 3 children, and then you would be the 4th. She did not have a crisis of faith, right? She, I guess, relied on her Catholic conviction and, did what she felt was the right thing. And I think that seems to be something that more people used to gravitate toward or identify with more so than today. And I'm not being judgmental and, glossing things over as the good old days, but religion seems to have played a smaller and smaller role in people's lives. There's been a movement away from family and religion for decades and decades, if not generations. And for those of us who do believe, you feel like you're in a minority of sorts. And what we're talking about more specifically is being able to practice your faith in light of the fact that your family is experiencing disability. And in the few remaining minutes that we have, what I'd like each of you to do is reflect on some resources, either ones that you're in immediate contact with, or other resources that you might be able to share with our viewers, so that we can include those in what I would call the show notes or the YouTube notes, so that people will not only hear the message here tonight, but to be able to access some additional resources. So Cory, back to you.
Yeah, so I briefly mentioned one because we've been doing this in our Bible study at church, about callings, about vocation, Latin word vocatio, in plurals, all of those things that we in our lives are given tasks for. And so I'll just kind of put a plug. He's a campus pastor at Concordia University, Chicago, Dr. Jeff Leininger. But callings for life, God's plans, your purposes, has been a very good tool to have conversation about that. You know what? God even loves dirt. Our role with diapers and sippy cups is a God-pleasing vocation to serve in that regard. Not to minimize, roles of fathers who do have to get their hands dirty at times and set aside careers in order to care for the family that's around them. These are godly tasks that are provided and given the ability to then support. I also mentioned Voice of Care. They have great resources with disability ministry as far as setting up congregations, ensuring that there are places and locations within the church for children and adults with disabilities to feel welcomed and participate. And I tell you, we've talked a lot about respite care as well. And I think this plays into the idea of caregiving. It is a valiant task 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to care for someone. And it tires people out. And we need rest. The Lord rested on the seventh day after creation because he needed it, because it was a model for us. And we need our rest. That care is shown in that respite care situation as well, to interact and say, hey, can I give you some time away? Maybe just to go to sleep, take a nap, maybe go to the grocery store, have a cup of coffee. It's just a loving compassion. And so we've actually done some respite care training through our congregation of individuals who are willing to ask the question, please tell me in a very short way, how can I care for your loved one while you're gone for an hour, 2 or 6 hours? How can we medically support? How can we do it? We don't always have the nursing or medical background, and yet, what can you share? So I would simply point to just respite care training is a great opportunity within disabled families to show love and compassion, to say, let me give you time you can step away and just refresh and rest.
Cory, you raise a really important point, which has to do with the ability to get some time off to recharge your battery. And when we make our closing statements, I'll make reference to a couple of, I think, really important resources in the area of respite. So, Bill.
Yeah. Pastor Cory makes a good point about the one-on-one respite care, dealing with an individual. From a societal perspective, I would like to say, I happen to pull this off my bookshelf, a book called Who Really Cares by Arthur Brooks. He's an academic who looks at survey research, and he talks about what makes a positive, well-working society, and it's about caring. And he talks about who gives and who doesn't, and why it matters. And he talks about not only giving your money, but also giving your time to others. That makes a more vibrant society. And it's so often we relegate things to, well, let the government do it. Well, he says that's not the way it works. He goes back to the founding of the country and says, what we really need is a a backbone of those who care, for others within their own town, their city, their state, and we've gotten away from that, and that is really unfortunate. There's you talked about the decline of church attendance, and that's certainly that is a problem. If we have the breakdown of some of these basic social institutions, the need for gathering within a church, or for that matter, the breakdown of Rotary and Kiwanis. About 20 years ago, maybe a little less than that, there was a book titled "Bowling Alone," by a Harvard sociologist. His name escapes me at the moment, but he talks about this idea of the disintegration within society of we just don't have this cohesion anymore. And I think, we really have to get back to that, not only on a, one-on-one basis, for people we know, but for the greater society. I sure hope we can regain that. I want to be optimistic. I really do. But boy, I look at the trend right now, and it's more isolationism and less caring, which is unfortunate. But we must reverse it, and we will. I hope.
Bill, thanks for sharing. So I've identified 5 additional resources that I'd like to share, and we'll put this in the notes that go along with the recording of the YouTube. And the first is an organization out in Agora Hills, California, which goes by the name Johnny and Friends. That's Joni and Friends. And Johnny Erickson Tatata is a woman who's about 70 years old. She experienced severe disability, became a quadriplegic at about age 18. And now for 50-something years, she's led this global Christian ministry. And one of the things that they do in the areas that they operate is to have these family retreats multiple times a year that allows family that have experienced disability to come together, the whole family. And they have these amazing individuals, some people think of them as angels, the volunteers, who will take the child or children with special needs so that the siblings and the parents can enjoy a certain level of respite. And it's like a vacation experience. And those that have participated refer to these as some of the most memorable and enjoyable things that they do every year. So Johnny and Friends is one that comes to mind. There's the Tim Tebow Foundation, which is down in Florida. And they have these amazing church-based programs, the most well-recognized of which is the Night to Shine. And it's just one night a year, usually in February, where the individuals with special needs, these children and young adults, are, the king and queen for the night. And while it's a very short amount of respite for mom and dad, it's an opportunity for them to come together and experiencing something that they might not otherwise experience because they might not be going to the prom or the homecoming dance or something like that. And I know that in working with the people at the Tim Tebow Foundation, they're actually bringing something to market, which is, what are they going to do the other 364 days a year? So the Night to Shine is one night a year, and they're calling it Shine On. So I think that's another great resource. There's another organization in Ohio called Key Ministry, which was started a couple decades ago by one of our Special Fathers Network mentor fathers, Dr. Stephen Gersovich. And they're also a Christian ministry that provides so many different resources for families. There's another organization in Kansas City started by Stephen Hunsley, Doc Hunsley, and it's called SOAR, Special Opportunities, Abilities, and Relationships is what SOAR stands for. And they do a lot in the area of spirituality and working with people from different religious backgrounds. And then the last that I'd like to mention, and this is just sort of all within the Special Fathers Network individuals that are connected most directly, is a program in Cookeville, Tennessee which is called Rise Above Ministries. And it was started by Jeff and Becky Davidson. And this goes back a dozen or so years. Sadly, Jeff lost his life a couple, 3 years ago. And Becky's continued the ministry. And those are just a handful, literally a handful of resources that come to mind, in addition to the books that were mentioned earlier that we'll include in the resource page for tonight's show. And what I'd like to do is ask each of you if there's anything else you'd like to share before we wrap up. So Cory, back to you.
I think the concluding statement I want to make kind of takes us back to what this topic was, the role of spirituality. We live in a lost world, a world that, although we may be optimistic, certainly continues to have its problems in our society. Whether it's a generational thing or whether it is simply a longevity of a nation that established its roots and maybe has lost its ways or has been hindered through power and authority in different ways. But to get back to spirituality really places it back into a smaller environment, into a home, into a group setting. You know, when we think about faith, and faith being a trust and confidence of the heart in the things we know to be true, right? We can believe, but that's different than faith. And so just trying to, point out those differences of knowledge, belief, and I like to think of faith as this empty basket that just receives the gifts that come. And it's the heart that trusts in it. And I know, Dr. Danko brought up, other commandments of honoring father and mother and authority and such, and the wonderful personal story of life and thou shalt not murder is fifth commandment. It all goes back to the first commandment. Right? Have no other gods. Fear, love, and trust are the three phrases. Fear, love, and trust above all things in God. That becomes what that role is. What is it that we are going to trust in this life? What is it that we are going to place our hope in, regardless of what that spirituality name is? Where are we going to look for hope? Where do we find it? I'll end with that.
Thank you, Cory. Bill, is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I concur with Pastor Cory's summary here. It all comes down to, are you going to actually do something? In a minor way, I've done something. I helped my brother, certainly, but I've helped now 21 strangers. I mean, in the sense of, for 21 years now, I've had a scholarship at the University at Albany, State University of New York, where I was a professor. It's called the Milton and Mary M. Danko Golden Rule Award. And it's based on just that, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And if we, I have students who get selected every year who have an idea or a predilection to be a giver of their time and volunteer to organizations. One of my favorite winners, if I could have a favorite winner, last year's winner was a volunteer fireman. And in his essay, he said, I'll go into a burning building to save somebody. Now, you talk about selflessness. You talk about somebody who's willing to give. And, there are other students who, work in food pantries, and that's all good. There's in helping the disabled, and that's all good. My point is, if we can encourage the next generation to have this spirit of giving and recognize that they have that spirit, and in this modest scholarship that I have, and we also have a parallel scholarship at Teal College in Western Pennsylvania, where my wife went to school, a Lutheran school, named after her parents. It's about, how do we encourage the next generation to be givers of their time, their effort, helping others? And if we can, encourage that as a a basic idea within our society, I think we'll all be better off. Givers are better than takers is my takeaway here.
Well, Bill, thanks for sharing, and thanks for mentioning the Milton and Mary Danko Golden Rule Awards. I think that was a great way to wrap up another example of what we can do within our control to inspire others, right? To aspire to doing the right thing, to look out beyond themselves, especially at a young age, like I know that those awards are meant for. So I just want to thank each of you for participating this evening and being part of this most recent episode of the Special Fathers Network biweekly Zoom calls on the topic of the role of spirituality. And there's a rich library of other Zoom calls that we've done that are available at the 21CD YouTube channel. So I would encourage our viewers to check the other topics out as well. And if you haven't already, by all means, please listen to the Special Fathers Network Dad to Dad podcasts, not only by these two gentlemen, but by the other 140 plus others that have been interviewed to date. And the 21st Century Dads Foundation, again, is the creator of the Special Fathers Network, the Dad to Dad mentoring program for fathers raising children with special needs. And resources can be found at the website, which is 21stcenturydads.org. Thanks again. We'll see you again.